So I think we may as well get cracking and go ahead. And I think if anybody does turn up a little bit later, then they can just play catch up. So thank you for everybody who is attending. So this is our quarterly charity hub presented by us at Bioni Law and Make UK, who we've got Lucy here from Make UK. Lucy, give us a wave. And this topic is around generational diversity, which is something that we've been discussing quite a lot across both Bioni Law and Make, because it is very relevant that the different generations approach things differently, and maybe you need to take that into account when you're thinking about how you manage them. So just for some admin, we are recording this session so that it can be sent out to people and shared publicly. So please do be mindful not to share any confidential information in the main session. If you would like to discuss anything confidential, then there are both our general email address there and the one for Make. Please do feel free to contact us individually. Obviously, anybody on this call that knows any of us personally, we've also got our personal or our work email addresses that will come directly to us, and feel free to drop any of us a line. So about the Charity Hub, we at both organisations, we do support charities as much as we can, and we understand that within the charity sector you do get quite unique challenges that are thrown at you, and so we like to tailor these things to topics that we know have come up with a lot of our charity clients that we think would benefit you as a group. So we designed the Charity Hub to help leaders, professionals and trustees tackle current people challenges in your sector, and so it enables you to learn from sector experts, share challenges and build supportive peer connections. So please feel free as we're going through it to make any comments in the chat. You know, it might be helpful for you to have the chat up so that anybody who, even if you're not making comments, you can see anything that's going to be discussed, any thoughts, any reflections or any questions that you might have. I'm not doing the presenting, it's my colleague Lorna and Lucy who are going to be doing the presenting, so I'll be in the chat box answering any questions that might come up. Any I can't answer for whatever reason, then when we come to the end of it, then I'll throw them to either Lorna or Lucy. And so what we're going to cover today is understanding the generational attitudes and motivations, avoiding age bias and staying legally compliant, managing intergenerational conflict, building inclusive wellbeing and engagement strategies, and practical leadership approaches for diverse teams. And I think now I'm going to hand over to Lorna, who will be taking you through the first section.
Okay, thank you, Kat. Okay, so attitudes at work. So our attitudes are shaped by experiences, how we grow up, the messages we receive, and the beliefs we form as, from those experiences. The societal standards around us, our expectations, achievements, environments, and exposure to different ideas all influence how we see the world. As life changes, so do our views, and sometimes they become stronger, other times they evolve completely. Sometimes when we think about generational differences, we tend to think of them at quite a superficial pop culture level. The music people listen to, the TV shows, the films they watch, the trends, the humour that shape their childhood. For example, I grew up in fairly low budget children's TV. Any Gen Xers on the call might remember Button Moon. Kids TV was only available at limited times of the day, whereas my children have grown up with like fast-paced, highly stimulating, on-demand content. My mum grew up with even more limited television, and the cartoons of that time sometimes reflected some of the attitudes and social norms of that time, which we would now see as problematic in how they portrayed things like race or gender. If we move beyond pop culture, we can look at the wider influences that shape these generations. So here we can see some of the significant changes that have occurred throughout the history alongside periods of economic growth, uncertainty, social change. There are events such as war, recession, disease, technological advancement, political movements, and changing social attitudes, and they all influence how people experience the world during their childhood and early adulthood. These experiences are believed to play a fundamental role in shaping our expectations, values, behaviour, and attitudes towards work and life. Over time, those shared experiences can create what we often refer to as generational cohorts, groups of people who may identify with similar social norms, values, and behaviours because of that world they grew up in. Generations who experience economic instability might place higher value on job security and stability, whereas generations who grew up with rapid technological advancement may value flexibility, speed, and instant access to information. However, it's important to remember that we're still talking in broad strokes. Not every person within a generation had the same upbringing, opportunities, influence, or life experiences, and these trends just help us understand patterns and perspectives, but we should never use them to stereotype individuals. Throughout this session, we will explore how these experience and influence present themselves in the workplace, in terms of people's attitudes and behaviours, the opportunities and the challenges that they can create, and how managers can lead multi-generational teams effectively and inclusively. So let's look at the different generational cohorts then. So generations tend to span around 20 years. This time span is not fixed, but it's based on the cycle of historical events and whether and their impact. Whilst it's important to understand the differences and how they originated, as I said, we must be careful not to stereotype or pigeonhole people, as we are all individual. However, there are currently 4 generations within the workplace. So we have baby boomers. They're named because of the huge surge in births after World War II. That group starts in about 1943 and ends around 1960. Characteristics will often include being very committed, self-sufficient, and competitive. Generation X are those born between approximately 1961 and 1981. They grew up in a time when technology was advancing fast, but it wasn't as readily available as it is today. Because of this, generation straddles both the digital and non-digital world. And characteristics can often include things like resourceful, logical, and good problem solvers. Millennials, or sometimes referred to as Gen Y, they're the largest population currently in the workforce. They're those who were approximately born between 1982 and 2005. They're the first generation to be digital natives. This makes them extremely self-sufficient, and they no longer rely on others to solve their problems or teach them things. They have the internet for that. Their defining characteristics can include being curious, being confident, and questioning authority. So Gen Z, those are those people born approximately 2005 to 2029. This group, 2019. This group is young. They have never known life without tech. Some of their characteristics include ambitious, digital natives, confident again. Then those born from 2012 are defined as Generation Alpha. Although we only have the 4 generations in the workplace currently, we do still have the influence of 5 or 6, because baby boomers and Gen Xers who entered the workplace under management of generations before them, and some of those generations may reach back as far as the kind of the second industrial revolution, when you consider how we hang on to some of those practices that now may be over 100 years old and not necessarily in line with technical advancement. So you can see how there may be a need for change and reflection. So the generational diversity affects values and approaches when it comes to work and work style. And so whilst it is true that not everyone will conform exactly to their generational defining characteristics, understanding those generational types can give us greater appreciation on how different generations operate and are motivated. Again, this is broad strokes, but baby boomers and to a limited extent Gen X may not be as technically proficient as millennials or Gen Z. This can lead to frustration in both directions, depending on one's point of view. It may appear that the company or senior managers are not keeping up with technological advances and are old-fashioned, or that younger generations are too focused on technology and miss out on tried and tested traditional arrangements. Gen Z have grown up in a world where people are more able to express themselves, partly due to legislation changes. There's more inclusion and protection for minority groups, and they may have a zero tolerance for discrimination. They may be offended by banter that they deem unfair or inappropriate. Baby boomers that grew up in what is often termed different times will sometimes struggle to understand why people are so offended. Gen X are typically considered to be hardworking and bringing in high revenue. They may be more ready to work long hours, including weekends, and may have poor work-life balance. This may be due to them starting work following a time of recession and high unemployment, whereas Gen Y and Gen Z tend to have a more balanced approach to work and life, and may seek work in ways that suit their interests and obligations outside of work. Due to their impressive technology skills and abilities to multitask across multiple platforms, they may, for example, struggle to understand why they need to be in the office 8 hours a day when they could have be more productive working 6 hours with a later start. Gen Z have grown up in a digital world. Information is at their fingertips and they're able to check and critique information. This could be a frustration for boomers and Gen Xers who are trusted for their experience and knowledge. Gen Z have high levels of respect for themselves, and they can withdraw boundaries and embrace diversity and different and value ethics and sustainability. So how is this specifically affecting the charity sector? So if you joined us for the previous Charity Hub webinar on mental health, we discussed what drives people to join the charity sector, and we agreed that many staff will be values driven, which could mean the older generations in your charity are in fact more aligned with the young Gen Z employees. But as we also discussed last time, there are pressures and challenges that you are facing in your sector. And I think when staff are under pressure, then there is more risk of conflict, and those generational differences could be amplified negatively in such circumstances. So if we look at motivators, you may have heard of Hertzberg's two-factor theory of motivation. In simple terms, Hertzberg suggested that there are two things that influence how people feel at work. Firstly, there are the things that genuinely motivate us, so meaningful work, achievement, recognition, growth, responsibility, and development. And then there are what he called the hygiene factors, things like pay, policies, relationship, job security, and working conditions. Now, these don't necessarily motivate people when they are present, but when they're poor or they're missing, then they can create dissatisfaction quite quickly. What's interesting when we think about the generational diversity is that most people fundamentally want the same things from work, but different generations may prioritize them differently. So this chart demonstrates how we shift our priorities over time. So it's interesting to see here that recognition and well-being are not a priority for over 55s, but trust and openness with leadership is. Well-being is very much a priority for the younger generations. It's worth trying to understand your team and what they prioritize, and then understand that those priorities will change over time. So, do we think that people working in the charity sectors have different priorities? The likelihood is that pay and purpose sit differently in terms of people's priorities. That isn't to say that pay doesn't matter, but sometimes constraints within your sector mean that they can't always compete on salary, but you can outperform on purpose, autonomy, impact, and building a good environment and a culture will help recruit and retain across the generations. So if we have a quick look at communication, so beyond motivations, something else which there may well be generational differences is around how we communicate with people. So different generations will have different preferences. If you consider how they came into the workplace or how technology evolved during their working time, you can see how their experience have shaped their preferences. Our baby boomer generation is actually the only generation which prefer the instant two-way dialogue. Their communication trends also tend to be formal and structured through networks and hierarchy, whereas millennials and Gen Z can struggle with email. They tend to find it too formal, a bit like the baby boomers and Gen Xers like myself getting a letter in the post. They can find phone calls too slow and face-to-face impractical, time-consuming, and possibly confrontational. They prefer more mobile-enabled approaches such as text and instant messaging, and for Gen Z, voice notes, which is then only half the conversation. So these approaches may not foster an instant response, but it enables them to carry out other tasks in the meantime. It tends to cut out small talk, so it may seem efficient. However, some of the approaches might lead to miscommunication and misunderstanding. So while the preferences differ and there are benefits and challenges with all approaches, none are right or wrong. It's just different. It's not just how we communicate that matters as well, it's what we're communicating to. Again, different generations may have different preferences, but most people will respond well to communication that is clear, relevant, respectful, and consistent. So communication that feels unclear, inconsistent, or dismissive can quickly create frustration or conflict. Good communication will help people feel informed and respected, included, and trusted. Ultimately, good communication is not about treating everyone the same. It's about communicating in a way that helps different people work effectively together. I think it's worth discussing what the best method of communication is for your team and taking on board everyone's views and the organisation's requirements and then coming to a consensus. But in terms of tone, this is something that the manager can set expectations around and coach the team to follow. So if we look at opportunities and threats, so earlier we identified lots of strengths across the different generations. We spoke about resilience, adaptability, innovation, relationship building, digital confidence, problem solving, curiosity, and experience. So if I said you could build a team with all of those strengths combined, most organizations would see that as a huge advantage. Harnessing those different perspectives effectively can create huge opportunities for your charity. Different generations may approach different problems differently, they might challenge processes differently or communicate differently, and that can actually drive improvement and innovation within your organization. It can help your organization analyze procedures from different perspectives, challenge outdated ways of working, improve communication, and importantly, understand the needs of service users and stakeholders and communities. So in the charity sector, particularly, having a workforce with different lived experiences and perspectives can be incredibly valuable when engaging with your service users and responding to their changing social needs. Cross-generational learning can also be incredibly powerful in the office. So more experienced employees may bring sector knowledge, resilience, and relationship building skills, whereas the younger generations might bring fresh thinking, digital confidence, innovation, and they might challenge traditional approaches. So when organizations create environments where those strengths complement each other rather than compete with each other, teams can become stronger and more adaptable and more effective. So whilst generational diversity can bring huge strengths, it can also create challenges if those differences are not managed well. One of the biggest risks is exclusion and lack of belonging. So, for example, if you have an existing team of quite young members and an older employee who maybe has caring responsibilities, might feel left out of social activities or team culture if that younger team are kind of going out after work in the evenings, whilst younger employees joining a long-established team may struggle to feel accepted, listened to, or included. Sometimes this exclusion is intentional, but often it can be subtle or unconscious. Another challenge is generational stereotyping or banter. Comments such as snowflake, granddad, too old-fashioned, always on their phone, may be dismissed as jokes, but they can create division, damage relationships, and potentially cross into harassment under the Equality Act. Communication styles can also create tension. One person might want quick, instant messaging and see that as efficient and productive, while another may experience them as abrupt or impersonal. Some employees prefer face-to-face discussion and relationship building, while others value speed, flexibility, and convenience. We can also see conflict arising from different expectations around work and ways of working. For example, attitudes towards flexible working, office presence, feedback, autonomy, technology, and work-life balance. Often the issue is not that one person is right or another is wrong. It's just that people simply have different expectations shaped by different experiences. So just in case you experience any of these challenges with your team, I'm going to spend a bit of time on managing conflict. So conflict is natural in any workplace, but generational differences can sometimes amplify any misunderstandings. Like we have already said, the issue is not one generation is right and the other is wrong. And as we had already said, people simply just have different expectations and experiences and communication styles. One person may see direct feedback as efficient and honest, while another might see it as abrupt or disrespectful. Add in any assumptions and stereotypes about different generations, and misunderstandings can escalate quickly. In charities, particularly where people are often value-driven and emotionally invested in the work they do, conflict can sometimes feel very personal. And the challenge for managers is recognizing when conflict is really a misunderstanding about communication or expectations rather than capability or conduct. So conflict resolution is not about deciding who is right and who is wrong. In most workplace conflicts, both people will feel justified that their perspective is correct. The role of the manager is to slow the situation down, understand what is really driving the issue, and then create safe and respectful conversation. One of the biggest mistakes managers can make is focusing purely on personalities. You know, someone's being difficult, they're too sensitive, they never listen, and instead focus on behaviours, communication, expectations, and underlying needs. It's important not to avoid difficult conversations. Usually unresolved tensions grow quietly in the background, and then trust starts to erode and collaboration reduces, morale can suffer, and small issues can become bigger problems, and it can expand throughout your team and workplace. In charities, especially, unresolved conflict can have a significant impact on well-being, morale, and retention, because teams are often emotionally invested in the work and the mission. So the aim with dealing with conflict is not to necessarily make sure that you're kind of building friendships. It's just to ensure that you've got a respectful and effective working relationships. Okay, so one simple framework that can be used for difficult conversations is LEAP. It's important to remember that conflict resolution is rarely one conversation. So good managers will follow up afterwards and make sure the relationships have genuinely improved and that tensions don't resurface. Can I have the next slide, Alice? Okay. So we've spoken about conflict management, which is reactive, but what proactive steps can we make in terms of leadership and culture to avoid conflict and embrace the diversity in our teams? So one of the biggest risks when managing multi-generational teams is the unconscious bias that we bring ourselves to that management. So we all naturally make assumptions based on our own experiences, our preferred communication style, how we like to work, and what we think good work looks like. Often managers lead in a way they themselves prefer to be led, but that may not work for everyone. Some employees may value autonomy and flexibility, whereas others may want structure, support, and regular feedback. As we have already discussed, some prefer to communicate differently, And the key is not to stereotype people or assume behavior is linked purely to age. Instead, focus on the individual, identify strengths, understand their motivations is really important, and then remain adaptable. Strong multi-generational leadership is about curiosity rather than assumption. And it's also important to remember that every generation brings strength. The goal is not to get everyone to think the same. The goal is to create an environment where those differences strengthen the organisation rather than divide it. You need to be flexible and recognise that one size no longer fits all when it comes to leadership and communication. Okay, next slide, please, Alice. So with that in mind, it is good to identify what works best for your individuals in the team in terms of methods and communication. So have regular one-to-ones, create an environment where everyone is comfortable sharing their ideas and concerns, educate your teams on generational differences. That can be through organisational-wide training or in your one-to-ones, coaching your team on how to work with others. Set expectations for ways of working and define roles, but be prepared to have a little flex should you introduce new members to your the team, or the business requirement change. And then from diverse project teams or for training or shadowing, make sure that you are on hand to support and guide so that people can appreciate each other's ideas during collaboration rather than it creating any hostility. And just make sure, and finally, just make sure that your team are equipped to navigate conflict in the workplace. So yeah, conflict resolution training is kind of key, just for not just for managers, but everyone within the team. Can I have the next slide, Alice? And again. So in terms of creating an inclusive culture, what are the best practices that companies can adopt to foster a culture of inclusivity across different age groups? So it's important to have a look at your policies and your procedures and the framework that you have in place. I would say it's really important to complete impact assessments regularly, and then ensure flexible working policies are accessible to all and that you respond to requests fairly and in line with statutory requirements. With regards to training, we've mentioned this already, but provide regular EDI training and anti-harassment training for all staff. Focus on challenging age-related assumptions and unconscious biases. And then training should be up-to-date, practical and relevant to all generations. Then you want your senior leadership teams, your trustees and your managers to be role modeling an inclusive culture. So moving beyond the policy and showing inclusion in their daily behaviours, leadership, and showing genuine flexibility. Managers should be respectful and their behaviour should demonstrate openness to learning from all generations and reinforcing a culture where diversity of age is seen as a strength. And then I would say just nip it in the bud. So managers should champion kind of age positive practices, and they should challenge any ageist attitudes to recruitment and development and their daily interactions. You need to challenge any stereotypical or derogatory remarks made, such as set in their ways or stroppy teenager. That can amount to harassment, and it should be managed through internal disciplinary procedures if necessary. And finally, you want to review the data. So you want to have a look at your recruitment and retention data. You want to have a look at any employee engagement feedback that you're receiving, and have a look at if you're getting grievances or any disciplinary data that you have. And just make sure that you're gathering feedback and identifying and addressing any age-related gaps or issues, and then use that data to inform targeted interventions, monitor progress. And what you can do is you can also use that data then to revisit your policies and procedures and make sure that they are inclusive. So it becomes cyclical, that once you review that data, you can go back to the policies, the training, the role modeling, and kind of dealing with any issues. Can we move on to the next slide, Alice? Okay. So that's me done. So I'm going to pass on to Lucy, who will be able to talk to you about the legal aspects of generational diversity. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you, Lorna. So that was so comprehensive. I have very little to add on the legal side of things, because a lot of this is about managing your staff and knowing a little bit about what makes your individuals tick and how people work well as teams and addressing any issues that arise. And I think Lorna's really been very thorough in the kind of the HR side of managing a multi-generational workforce. There's not a lot of real bones of law in this, and I think that those of you who are listening who are experienced HR managers will be very comfortable with the kind of legal aspects of it. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes just trotting through just to kind of recap on some of the particular points that Lorna has made and just kind of putting it in a legal wrapper, as it were, rather than an HR focus. So the first slide is quite obvious, really. We're looking at, the definition and demographics. We were talking about that nowadays there's possibly 4 or even 5 generations spanning in the workplace. You've got people in their early careers. You've got people who are working well beyond traditional retirement ages, and it's this demographic which is kind of driven by longer life expectancy. Obviously, the default retirement age was abolished, some time ago now. There are economic pressures for people working longer, and there's lots of different attitudes towards careers and retirement in the workplace. So that's the context which we're talking about, and Lorna very helpfully explained that thoroughly. In terms of the legal implications, this kind of multi-generational working is going to be significant because, of course, we're looking at age discrimination. Age diversity directly intersects with employment law in your obligations to comply with employment law. And that's going to focus on both equality, but fairness. And the key thing is going to be consistency. A lot of what I say in the next few minutes is going to be about consistency of approach, consistency of treatment. An employer is going to need to be navigating between different expectations of your staff's work patterns, your individual career progressions that might be in place. We talked about technology use, and we think about people's retirement expectations, and all the while you have to have your compliance hat on, thinking about how does how does this interact with any legal implications. Of course, the legal risks don't arise necessarily just because of the fact you've got a diverse age workforce, but from assumptions. And I think Lorna touched on this quite well, in the sense that throughout this, you've got to think about challenging assumptions and stereotypes, and making sure that kind of informal practices that are apparent in the workplace aren't kind of influencing decision making. So, we've talked about it before, but assuming younger workers are more adaptable, better with technology, and that older workers are less ambitious, those kind of assumptions get you into hot water when it comes to age discrimination claims. They're likely to, if you're not careful, lead you down the road to an unlawful outcome, even if it's unconsciously done, and the kind of idea of that, it wasn't my intention to offend or to cause any concern, but it's the stereotypes and the assumptions are the real challenge in the piece. The multi-generational working also really magnifies perhaps the importance of having clear policies in place. Inconsistencies are going to be quite easily identified when you're comparing age groups within the workplace. Focus on recruitment, training. I think recruitment is one of those ones that most HR managers will have a real eye to trying to ensure that their kind of recruitment processes and practices are not going to discriminate against on an age-based basis. But training is one that sometimes people can catch people out, offering kind of training to the young leaders and that type of thing. So inadvertently, you're focusing on a particular age group. Performance management, flexible working. We'll look at those in just a tiny little bit more detail in the coming slides. just from a kind of practical point of view, when you're looking, if it all goes horribly wrong and you're in the tribunal, I think that the point I would make here is that tribunals are really getting, the expectation is increasing that employers really need to demonstrate their decisions are evidence-based and objectively justified. And if an employer is trying to defend a practice that is just something that they've feels like it's rooted in cultural norms or historical practices, that's where they're going to get into some difficulties. So you've really got to understand the legal framework to kind of make sure that you can limit your exposure to legal claims. And I think probably I would say, just on conclusion of this slide, that the multi-generational working represents both an opportunity and a compliance challenge. And I think that mirrors some things that Lorna's saying, a lot of the challenges, and it requires employers to really embed age-aware thinking into your everyday people management practices, and while treating age, as they would any other protected characteristic, whether it's sex or race or religion, that kind of thing in the workplace, age is just another protected characteristic that you have to be fully aware of when you're managing your workforce. Pop on to the next slide, please. So this won't be new to any of you. We're talking about discrimination on the basis of age. And so if someone's treated less favourably because of their age or perceived age, then that is where you're going to get into difficulties and face potential legal claims. Of course, age, everybody has an age, and sometimes the law talks about age groups. And so you might be looking at ensuring that candidates are not rejected for being too junior, or experienced workers aren't excluded from training that's kind of geared towards those early in their careers. And I think, as Lorna said, these are all challenges that HR professionals are tackling with routinely. Indirect discrimination is a bit more subtle. Obviously, it tends to arise when you've got what seems to be a neutral practice, but operates in a way that has a particular disadvantage to a group or an age. So the kind of things that might fall into the trap there would be possibly around full-time working requirements, thinking about your benefit structure and length of service requirements, and possibly training programs. Those are the kind of indirect discrimination risks that you might face when you're looking at age discrimination. We talked a bit before about harassment. That's obviously unwanted conduct related to protected characteristic, in this case age, and which has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity. And so kind of those classic jokes that people, old cards with, old fart cards for your birthdays, or something that's workplaces historically thought of it as banter, that can very quickly get into age-related issues, and calling somebody, wet behind the ears, or some of those kind of really obvious ones. So you need to be really mindful of that, because of course it has been the case for some time that employers are going to be liable for age-related harassment. And you're going to need to prove, if you're trying to defend such a claim, that you took reasonable steps to prevent that from happening. And that's not just age discrimination, harassment based on age, but obviously the key one often is for employers focus on will be sexual harassment. But it's a similar principle. An employer needs to be demonstrating, if it's to defend a claim like that it took all reasonable steps to prevent that kind of action from happening. And therefore, it's going to be important to look at the training that your managers have and the policies and practices you have in the workforce. So all these kind of direct, indirect and harassment type claims, all these kind of forms of discrimination based on age are going to often frequently overlap. And a single set of facts might well give rise to potential multiple claims. And so as HR professionals, you need to think about how the everyday decisions and interactions you have with your workforce fit within all these definitions, and in order for you to essentially manage your multi-generational workplace lawfully. Next slide, please. Just taking the discrimination angle one step further, just as a reminder that unusually age discrimination can be direct age discrimination can be objectively justified, as can indirect. But an employer is going to really need to, if it's going to successfully defend a claim, it needs to not just be able to look to a legitimate purpose or legitimate aim around the alleged treatment, but also that the achieving that aim was proportionate. kind of aims that the tribunals have accepted that might feel age discriminatory, but have felt to be a legitimate aim might include often workforce planning, the encouragement of progression within the workforce. But it's not just looking at the legitimate aim, it's looking at whether the aim is proportionate. So it's a really careful balancing act. The employer is going to have to look to show that the discriminatory impact of the policy or the practice or the treatment was no more than necessary. And you need to be able to demonstrate in the event of in the tribunal that no less discriminatory alternatives are around. So it's quite a careful balancing exercise to rely on objective justification. It's sometimes quite difficult to satisfy that threshold. So the objective justifications, you often will be in that territory when you're looking at your benefit structures. If there's a redundancy scheme that's got enhancements that look like they're pegged to age, or retirement related practices, those are kind of age related issues or practices in the workplace that may need to be objectively justified. And a tribunal is going to need to be shown that there was detailed reasoning as to the approach that the employer is taking. The tricky area here is relying on something that has always been this way. You know, the tribunal is never going to be satisfied that you're just relying on a long-standing practice. That automatic justification is not a helpful argument in that regard. So you need to be really mindful of how you can objectively justify your practices if you need to. And so regular review of your practices, talking about training with your managers that Lorna helpfully mentioned earlier on, all of those will significantly reduce your legal risk when looking at age-related potential justification. The next slide, please. Again, something that Lorna touched on, flexible working. I think one of the slides that Lorna showed demonstrated that flexible working is more significant or it's considered priority for kind of the middle strand of groups of age groups. But I guess my point here would be that, flexible working is a standard practice within the workplace, and it does appeal to most demographics, but for different reasons. And the difficulty employers often have here is that balance, not ensuring that the policy is applied fairly, assuming, that the younger end of the workforce who have childcare responsibilities are more deserving of their flexible working request to be met. Because of course everybody will have a different reason perhaps for requesting flexible working, whether it's you've got childcare responsibilities, you may have caring responsibilities for older parents, you may be in the kind of pre-retirement, wanting to kind of slow things down a little bit, there may be health reasons, there are lots of reasons that different flexible working requests will be submitted to you as an organisation. And it's that balance, right? And avoiding any stereotypes about which request or which requests from which age groups are more valid, as it were. So you will need to treat all these requests fairly. You will need to consider them and accept or reject them based on genuine business reasons. And then kind of record your decisions and ensure your line managers or those handling the flexible working requests know how to deal with them fairly and consistently. The risk here really relates to perhaps informally granting certain age groups more flexible working requests than others, kind of if those decisions unfortunately are based on assumptions about commitment or availability or something like that. So be mindful of what flexible working plays out in a multi-generational workforce. Next slide, please. Just mindful of the time, I've just got a couple more slides I want to whiz through quite quickly because I mentioned Lorna's covered most of this in great detail. When it comes to managing performance across the ages, I think probably it's probably a bit of a myth to suggest that different age groups need to be managed differently because of keeping them engaged or motivated. I think that there's not that much correlation between how well someone does at work and their age. The question here is to make sure that your managers and yourselves in HR a consistent approach to managing performance and capability, making sure your procedures are fair, regardless of age, kind of thing, making sure that if there is a skills gap that might be perhaps due to technology, that's plugged satisfactorily. And, don't define people by reference to their age. Think about, what it is that they need in order to do their job successfully. So I think probably on this slide, all I would really add was that kind of effective performance management in a workforce where you've got lots of different age diversity will depend very much on your clear standards, on documentations, and most importantly on your manager's confidence to apply your processes confidently. Next slide, please. The obvious one that's pegged to age is the conversation about retirement. Since the default retirement age was abolished, I think it was 2011 now. It is a conundrum for a lot of employers as to how to have that conversation when someone they think is retiring, reaching retirement age. Obviously, legitimate conversation to have a workforce and succession planning, but it does need to be handled sensitively. There is no right way to recommend how you jump into this conversation. Use your best HR skills to have the conversation sensitively and carefully, and don't make assumptions that just somebody is getting older, then they must be about to retire. But it is legitimate to have proper conversations. It is necessary for workforce planning, but just handle the process fairly, and kind of frame it around role requirements, performance, rather than age, and assumptions around the kind of future plans. If you do have a phased retirement or flexible exit options, those will tend to generate the conversations more organically anyway. But I think probably it's fair to say that poor handling of these types of exit conversations are the most common source of age discrimination or constructive dismissal claims that I've seen. So be mindful. And again, kind of echoing Lorna and repeating myself, but clear training for your managers to make sure that they can have these conversations sensibly and carefully is going to be really important. I think at 5 to 12, I will stop there and hand back over to Lorna for the conclusion. Or questions?
Do we have any questions? Catherine, has anything come in on the chat?
So no, there was nothing in on the chat that I needed to answer, so I didn't need to put my brain cells to use, thankfully. But does anybody have any questions now? If so, just put up your hand and we can throw to you. No?
Well, just while we're waiting, what I would just say is that some of the stuff there that we have said in terms of building that culture and recommendations we've made, I know that the charity sector is, struggling for funding at the moment, but none of the things that we have suggested there cost particularly any huge amounts of money. A lot of them can be implemented for free or at least cost effectively. And a lot of them can be rolled out quite quickly as well. And if you do have any questions or you do need any support or help with that, then do feel free to contact us.
Okay, great. So thank you. That was really interesting. And I think it's something that we are having lots and lots of conversations about, not only in the charity sector, but across all sectors that we support, where intergenerational diversity is a challenge. But I think you've given a good overview of a lot of measures that can be put in place, and a lot of tips and a lot of practical applications of things that can hopefully minimise the diversity causing problems within the team, and you can manage that team, those teams, in order to sort of make sure that those different approaches complement each other as opposed to work at odds with one another. So next slide, please, Alice. Just so that you know, we've got a few training and events coming up here, both with Bionic Law and with Make. So there is a list of them. You'll see at the bottom we have both our website and the Make UK website. If you want any further information on them, you can either look at those pages on the website, or you can get in touch with us and we can let you know what's coming up. There's some good things coming up. Anybody that's Sheffield or South Yorkshire based, it would be lovely to see you at our Bionic summer barbecue in June because we are raising money for Weston Park on using the Master Cutlers Challenge. So it would be great to raise as much money for the Master Cutlers Challenge as possible. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that, anybody who's Sheffield based. Okay. Some would say it's old news. I would say it's always new news because of all of the changes that are coming up. But as you are all, I'm sure, well aware, there are more changes to come in terms of the Employment Rights Act. They're going to be staged over the next sort of 18 months or so. So there are a lot of things that you need to keep on top of. We do offer both Make and ourselves offer an audit. If anybody would like any more information about that, again, you've got our emails. I think it's a valuable tool to use to make sure that you're getting all of your ducks in a row from a policy and contractual point of view, to make sure that you're good to go when all of the changes come in. And then on that same note, it's equally going to be important that you think about upskilling your managers in terms of managing their teams, because a lot of the changes are going to have, in some ways, an adverse impact upon employers. And so if you haven't got your processes in place and if your managers aren't doing what they need to do, then it really could get you in the sticks quite quickly. So it's always a really good idea to have training for your managers, both in general HR, but specifically for the things that are changing, so that they can be putting that into practice sooner rather than later, ready for when all of the changes come in. And then here you are, the QR codes to both of our newsletters, so that any of you who may not be already receiving our newsletters, you can give a quick click of those and get yourself signed up. And thank you all very much for attending.